Valley Electric brings you hour 3 of our program on this Tuesday, the 11th of January, 2022. If it's Tuesday and it's our final hour, it's the hour we bring Dave Bowman from Plausibly Live, the Dave Bowman Show podcast to the show. Dave, a historian and talker in his own right. He can craft a great story for us, and we're going to let Dave open each of these Tuesday 8 o'clock hours with a look at history. We're going to call it Dave Does History. And if you go to BillMick.com, headline for the show page there today is Undermining We the People. Had a vibrant discussion on that in the last hour of the program. Make sure you catch the podcast at BillMick.com or on the Bill Mick Live iHeartRadio channel if you missed any of that. And you'll catch all 3 hours of the show, our McNugget, our caller of the day. And I've got a vast job to do in selecting that caller. We have several good ones throughout the morning, and we'll get those all posted there for you in the podcast section when we get the opportunity to do so. There's a link to Dave's podcast at BillMick.com. I've also shared a specific link on the WMMB Facebook page to his 1876 series, taking a look at history, and I think Dave just does an amazing job of how it relates to what's going on in the country today, or whether it's anything is new under the sun. Dave Bowman, good morning. Welcome, my friend.
Good morning, Bill. How are you today?
I am very well. Having fun this morning and looking forward to this. I really have enjoyed your dives into history as I've listened to your various podcasts that do that, and I think it's a good opportunity to share some of that with this audience. Tell me where we're going to start today.
Yesterday you had a news story, and I don't know if you got to it because I didn't get to listen to the show yesterday, Bill, but you had an article about James Clyburn, congressman from South Carolina, the man who saved Joe Biden's campaign.
We did get a talk about that.
Clyburn made a comment that elections are too important to be left to the states.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that a very fascinating statement because on today of all days, to look at that, he did something that we call appealing to authority. When you're dealing with an argument and when you're dealing with a debate, you appeal to an authority. Well, this authority said that, so that makes it true. And if you recall, do you recall which authority he appealed to from the article?
Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton, who was born on January 11th. Today is Hamilton's birthday.
Oh, well, it's good. We've got him in play then. Happy birthday.
The ideas that Clyburn was sharing were part of an ongoing thing that has been going on in this country for, you could probably trace it back further, but I trace it back to 1876 is when it really, really got started. The first real election post-Civil War. Yes, I realize there were several elections before that, but really the first real election in the post-Civil War era was 1876, and it was a watershed moment for this country. It was a changing moment. And in that election, we find a lot of the myths that we find ourselves fighting today have their origin. For example, we're told that January 6th was unprecedented, that it never happened. In fact, we had one congressperson, I don't remember who it was. Was it Schumer, talking about Confederate flags flying in Washington, in D.C.? And this has never happened before, they were telling us. Remember this? That the violence of January 6th was unprecedented. Never happened before.
Oh, yeah. And while you're at that, my column tomorrow, that will be a reminder in the insider email for folks who are signed up there. It'll be posted at BillMick.com about 2 o'clock tomorrow. Deals with the insurrection, alleged insurrection. The title of the column is Not Even Close, and some observations about what did and didn't happen and what was and wasn't important through the last couple of years. But anyway, back to your point, saying this has never happened before, when yet, what, it has, I'm assuming.
Not only has it happened before, I wouldn't even put January 6th, 2020 in the top 5, if not even the top 10 incidents of election violence in this country's history just since 1876. So it's a myth, but it's a necessary myth. The left, the political left, the Democrat Party specifically, needs this myth. They need it because it serves their purposes. And that's why James Clyburn comes out and talks about federalizing elections.
Mm-hmm.
It's intriguing to me that when you look at the left, when you look at the Democrat Party, There's one founding father. You know they don't like Washington. You know they don't like Jefferson. You know they don't like, I mean, they're trying to cancel all these people. Who's the one guy that they love, that they're never trying to cancel?
I give up who?
The guy they put on musicals about. The guy whose birthday it is.
Mm-hmm.
Hamilton.
Okay.
They love Alexander Hamilton.
They also managed to change his race for the production, so that's good, too.
Well, that's not really surprising.
History's not important, you know.
Hamilton is an interesting framer. He's an interesting. He was a Confederate. It's probably a bad term. A confidant of George Washington, and a very close friend of Washington. But Washington liked him, but didn't always agree with him, and didn't like a lot of the things that he did. In the great debate of constitutionalism, you have two general ideas at the framing. You have the Jeffersonian idea, which is if the Constitution doesn't specifically say you can do it, you can't. And you have the Hamiltonian idea, which is if it doesn't say you can't do it, you can. And remember that these two men, Jefferson and Hamilton, were in the first cabinet with Washington and butted heads a lot over those kinds of things.
Isn't it nice to recognize that we had founders who could disagree very earnestly on these things and still sit down and craft a document that gave us the country that we have, and to be able to deal politically with each other in spite of those differences? We can't do that anymore today.
No, you couldn't do it today, and you wouldn't be allowed to do it today because you don't have a Washington sitting at the head chair controlling all this. You're not trying to convince a leader that your position is correct. You're trying to convince the populace to elect a leader who will do what you want them to do. That's the big difference. Mm-hmm. So Clyburn appeals to Hamilton in his, the importance, the elections are too important to be left to the states. And he quotes Hamilton. He actually says, this is a quote from Clyburn, that's why the states were not allowed to put term limits on federal officials.
Yep.
So the elections were not solely conducted by the states. That's why the Voting Rights Act was necessary, and that's why the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which, again, I don't know what he's talking about there. I think he means 15th, but why the 18th Amendment to the Constitution are necessary. Again, 18th is prohibition, so we're already having problems here, all because it had to go back to the states to determine, James Clyburn. In his appeal, however, is based on the ideas that Hamilton did share in Federalist 59, where he said, and this is a quote, every government ought to contain in itself the means of its own preservation, unquote. Now, what does Hamilton mean by that?
Let me leave that question hanging, and we'll let Dave answer it when we continue in just 60 seconds on Bill Mick Live. Gatto's Tire and Auto Service, one of our sponsors on the program, multiple locations around Brevard, having been serving this community for 50-plus years now. And while they're a local company, they offer national benefits, things like warranties, quality parts and tires, ASE-certified technicians, and an experienced staff. And one of the things I like about Gatto's, most sincerely, is that those employees, that experienced staff, they're making the best recommendations to you they can for the maintenance or repairs on your vehicle. That's important to me because I'm a mechanical idiot, and you know that. And I've come to trust the people at Gatto's to do what's right for my vehicle. And they also leave the decision up to me. Bill, this filter needs change. If I'm not ready to change, I don't change it. I change it whenever the next time I'm in. But they leave it to you, but they give you the best advice they can. That's why for me, for you, whether you're buying tires, having repairs or maintenance done on your vehicle, you've got to go to Gatto's. Plausibly Live, the Dave Bowman Show podcast. We've got the host with us, Dave Bowman, as we're taking a look at history. Dave, so with Hamilton and Federalist 59, what's he talking about specifically? Is Clyburn misusing it, or is he pointing it out correctly?
No, he's not misusing it, but he's doing what debaters and arguers were. He's telling the truth. He's appealing to an authority, but he's also not telling you the whole truth. And this is what politicians do, Bill. They tell you a little bit of truth, and you go, oh, that makes sense. until you stop and think about it.
Mm-hmm.
When Hamilton said that every government ought to contain in itself the means of its own preservation, what he meant was he was countering some of the anti-federalist arguments about the way that the Congress was being set up, and he specifically said if the Constitution, the proposed Constitution, had contained an article that said that the federal government will dictate to you, the states, how you elect your state legislatures, you would rightfully object to that. So why is it wrong for the federal government then to object to you complaining that we should be able to choose our own government, our federal government? And remember, in that era, the federal government and the state government were completely distinct.
Mm-hmm.
They were not, there was no crossing of the lines. They could at any moment annihilate it, he said, by neglecting to provide for a choice of persons to administrative affairs. If the states were allowed to dictate how the federal government was elected, they would be able to change the federal government. And that's not what he wants. And this is what Clyburn means. So is that the be-all, end-all? If you actually take a look at the source, Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution very clearly says, the times, places, and manners of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. So what Clyburn leaves out is that while Hamilton may have argued in the Federalist Papers that elections are very important and states should not be able to intervene with it, the Constitution says the states are supposed to regulate the election of federal officials.
That pesky Constitution, Dave, biting us again. We get into more. Dave Does History as we continue on Bill Mick Live. You want in? It's 321-768-1240.
Call Bill now, 321-768-1240. Common Sense on Common Radio.
And on a Tuesday, 8 o'clock hour, Dave does history in addition to the common sense that's in play. And a lot of common sense in the stuff Dave Bowman brings from Plausibly Live, the Dave Bowman Show podcast. Links on the show page at BillMick.com and a link to a series of Dave's podcast, 1876, posted for you on the WMMB Facebook page, in addition to being on my page at BillMick.com. Dave, we're talking Clyburn, Hamilton, and history. So where are we at now as far as, can Congress change these laws? Is Clyburn right in what he's asserting? Or is there a caveat we don't know about somewhere?
The response to that is, when you say that, but clearly the Constitution says that the state legislatures are responsible for regulating this, and this is what Clyburn said. It's too important to be left to the states. Well, unfortunately for him, that's what the Constitution says. Mm-hmm. Now, it may be that he's calling for an amendment to the Constitution because the Congress may at any time, by law, make or alter such regulations except to the places of choosing the senators. So now we're back to, well, Congress can change this. Can they? That's the question. Yes, they can. But let's talk about that. May at any time by law. What does that mean? Well, to make a law to change these things, what do you have to do? You have to get it past the House, get it past the Senate, and get it signed by a president. Mm-hmm. What's the Senate trying to do right now as far as voting rights things go? They're talking about doing away with the filibuster to prevent these very things from happening. In other words, yes, they can change it, but it requires the acquiescence of a majority of Congress, meaning a majority of the states. In other words, everybody's got to go along with this. Everybody has to, plurality has to agree to make these changes, and I'm not sure you have that at this particular point. This is the same argument that's used about Joe Manchin right now, Bill. Joe Manchin is subverting democracy, right? He's single-handedly stopping what the country wants.
Which is what these rules were designed to do. We talked that a couple of weeks ago, right?
Well, run the math, Bill. How many senators are opposing the Build Back Better thing right now? Is it a majority of senators or a minority of senators?
Be a majority.
Which is democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Clyburn left out the fact that the Constitution does give the states the right to manage these things until it's changed by either a constitutional amendment or by a specific law that would have to get past Congress. So my question is, Clyburn, where is your bill? Where is your constitutional amendment? You're appealing to the authority of Hamilton, but Hamilton is the one guy in the framing generation that most conservatives are very leery about because he was very much a big government guy. At one point during the convention, he actually proposed doing away with state governments entirely and just having one big national government. Alexander Hamilton is almost solely responsible for the Bank of the United States, in modern language, for the Fed. So you can see where he's not going to appeal to conservatives, at least not conservatives who think.
Let me ask you something you may not know. Was he in favor, because there was a bit of a movement to make George Washington king? Would he have gone that direction?
I mean, I don't know that he would or wouldn't have, but if anybody would have, it would have been Hamilton. Hamilton has almost worshipped Washington.
I was going to say, that's what it sounded like anyway. Yeah.
He was kind of his substitute father in some ways, but he was also very loyal to Washington. So if Washington had decided to go that way, I'm sure Hamilton would have supported it. Clyburn's comments, in my mind, Bill, they really echo the legacy of the 1876 election. Now, the 1876 election is a watershed moment in American history. As I said, it's the first real election post-Civil War. Prior to that, Grant had been elected twice, and I get that. But this was the first time that the South, the former Confederate states, really got involved in the election post-Civil War. And it makes you realize that 2020 wasn't even in the top 5 of American election violence. This is what I learned. When I got asked to do that series, I started going back into that and started looking at things. 1876 was a bloodbath in this country. Hundreds, if not thousands, if I can borrow from a Supreme Court justice, of people murdered in the streets. I mean, murdered, killed. People's votes were changed at gunpoint. Parties printed ballots that the Democrat Party in one county printed their party tickets to vote, because that's how you voted in those days, with Abraham Lincoln's picture on them. You talk about your dark money and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was nothing compared to what it is today. But we need this myth that January 6th was the worst ever, because it creates a perception of chaos. We've got to advocate for immediate change. We've got to solve problems, right? We've got to solve this problem. It's too important to be left to the states. Here in Washington State, our governor, Jay Inslee's solution to the January 6th problem is he actually wants he called for legislation the other day to make lies, quote unquote, about election results a gross misdemeanor in the state of Washington. So in other words, democracy, such as it is, depends on the concept of free speech. I mean, the bedrock of it is free speech. And Inslee's solution to something he doesn't like, the January 6th problem, is to squash free speech and to control elections. This is what Clyburn's trying to do. If you go back to the 1876 election, and I don't have time to go through the whole thing, I've got that series lasts about 4.5 hours if you listen to the whole thing.
Yeah, and the link's up for everybody on the WMMB Facebook page and at BillMick.com today, and it is very interesting and worth going through.
Right. Thank you for that. The main lessons, there are a lot of lessons from 1876, but the main ones I wanted you to take this morning are people do not change. They're the same. It doesn't matter from the beginning to the end. This is why the myth that the parties have changed position, the Democrats of today or the Republicans of the 1860s, is complete nonsense. But they need you to believe that myth, because if you believe that myth, you'll believe that the January 6th insurrection was the worst thing ever. The second lesson is if you dance with the devil, you're going to lose your soul. And once you lose your soul, you'll never get it back. And the other side will never let you get it back.
Oh, that's very true.
We have forgotten the events that led to one of the country's darkest eras. As I said, it was an era when votes were changed at the point of the gun, where people were lynched, people were murdered, people were gunned down.
Right. Dave, I want to explore that a little more. I watched the podcast yesterday, but I want to bring some elements of that out when we get a moment. Bear with me as I remind everybody that this hour's sponsor of the show is O'Galley Electric. Chris Hughes, the president of O'Galley Electric, a West Point grad, military veteran, an engineer, a registered professional engineer. All that makes difference for the big engineering jobs here around the state of Florida. And if you're looking for employment, he's a great employer. And they've got openings in every area of their business, from admin to sales, support, electricians. Yes, they need it all at O'Galley Electric. And I can't imagine a better employer to work for. Amazing benefits and just great folks to be around. And if you're looking for that home standby generator, well, Generac is the standard there. O'Galley Electric is a major Generac provider. They order these generators and have them in stock by the hundreds. Some generator folks taking 36 weeks to get one delivered to you. Not at O'Galley Electric. Call them today, 321-425-3343. After all, when it's not hurricane season, is when you need to be getting your hurricane preparations going. You can also learn more at eggenerators.com. That Generac home standby generator and O'Galley Electric, a great combination. Dave Bowman with us as we talk history in this day on this hour of Bill Mick Live. When we come back, we will get to your calls. We'll see what else Dave is pointing out about that 1876 election and the shenanigans going on, far worse than anything that I would have imagined. And we see what that's about as we continue. You want in here? 321-768-1240. Just after the top of the hour, the 5-minute mark, each of our hours between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., ending in that 6 o'clock hour, you get a cue to win that $1,000 at our nationwide grand in your hand. You enter the keyword on the website at WMMBAM.com. Bookmark that contest entry portal, enter it every hour, and win that $1,000. I want to see you do that. We're back in moments on WMMB. Well, Galley Electric brings you hour 3 of our Tuesday morning. Nice to have you with us on 92.7 FM WMMB. Insider email, a daily event that hits your inbox about 4 o'clock each afternoon. Tomorrow's edition, like always, will link you back to my blog page where my column for midweek will post. It's called Not Even Close, and it references the descriptions of the January 6th insurrection, which wasn't one. That's the whole point of Not Even Close. Dave Bowman from Plausibly Live, the Dave Bowman Show podcast, is with us on these Tuesday 8 o'clock hours. And, Dave, you're referencing the election, the presidential election, 1876, and what went on around it. And it was surprising to me when I watched the podcast yesterday that, well, not surprising that humans would do that to each other, but thinking that we were getting America back to a better place after the Civil War, it wasn't as easy as it seemed, huh?
It was not only not as easy as it seemed, it was the Democrat Party, which has tried hard to divest itself of this history, intentionally, knowingly, and willingly tried to essentially restore the antebellum culture. Maybe we can't own the slaves, but we can certainly rule them, and that was the whole point. And it even culminated in 1902 when Virginia rewrote their constitution, their state constitution, and the guy that was most in charge of that specifically said the purpose of rewriting this is to eviscerate the 15th Amendment. So because we don't know these things, we believe that January 6th was the worst political violence ever. We believe that electoral college challenges are unprecedented. Well, in 1876, there were 19 electoral college votes that were not just challenged. They were, again, people were willing to shoot at each other over them. The Congress's struggle with those 19 votes is amazing. Even Oregon, Bill, Oregon threw out one of its own electoral college votes. A Republican state threw out a Republican electoral college vote, the governor did, and put in a Democrat electoral college voter. And so it was a mess. And this idea that somehow or another January 6th was unprecedented and unheard of is only because we don't know our own history. If we knew our own history, we would look at people like James Clyburn and what he said and realize what he's trying to do, which is to manipulate people into believing that there's this horrible, horrible crisis that has to be solved and only he and Congress can solve it.
Yeah, and that is so wrong. Dave, the glaring example was Hamburg, South Carolina, and I really enjoyed the podcast yesterday when I had a chance to sit down and give it a look. I think people will be shocked when you tell them what happened at Hamburg.
It is one of the darkest moments in our history, and it's scary to think that the people, the ideological grandchildren of those people who did that are the same people who are standing there today telling you that January 6th was unprecedented and we need to start jailing people, we need to start arresting people, we need to punish them, because they're not doing anything differently than they did in 1876. They're just counting on the fact that you don't know anything about it, and because you don't know anything about it, you're willing to go along with it. And this is, of course, you know, the age-old mantra of history, Bill. Those who do not understand history are doomed to repeat it.
Very, very true. Very true. Give us a brief glimpse of Hamburg.
Hamburg was a small railroad port. It was located in South Carolina, directly across the river from Augusta, Georgia. In fact, the railroad bridge that they built is still there. But it was a freedman's town, so there were former slaves who lived in this town. And they were very supportive of Rutherford B. Hayes' candidacy. And the local Bourbon Democrats in South Carolina decided that they were going to make an example of these freedmen who would dare not support Tilden in the election. And so they marched in there and provoked an incident and ended up killing dozens of people in the streets, mowing them down, lynching people, all because they were going to vote for the wrong guy. They were going to vote for Hayes, the Republican, instead of Tilden, the Democrat. And in South Carolina, you had the concurrent election going on with the Republican governor, the Reconstruction governor, and a guy by the name of Wade Hampton was running against him. Now, Wade Hampton should be a name familiar to most people if you know history, because Wade Hampton was a Confederate general and very much a racist and very much a he did not want Reconstruction. He didn't believe in the 14th, 15th, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and he was determined to return South Carolina to where it was antebellum. And so that election was going on at the same time, and it was a mess, man, and it was all over the state. But Hamburg was really just the tragedy of all of it. And what's really the tragedy about Hamburg is that there's no monument there today. There's no statue there. There's no monument there, because even to this day, the resistance to remembering that by the Democrat Party down there is so firm that they actually had to put the monument on the other side of town in an area where it was, quote unquote, safe to remember.
Wow. That is something. And you can catch all the details in the podcast linked up for you at my page at BillMick.com and on the WMMB Facebook page. We continue with your calls with Dave Bowman when we come back in 60 seconds on WMMB. Oh, Galley Electric is our hour sponsor. Dave Bowman, the host of Plausibly Live, the Dave Bowman Show podcast. We get to those phone calls now. Let's check in first with John in Palm Bay. John, welcome to Bill Mick Live.
Reference to the 1876 election, Brevard County had a lot to do with it. At that time, with a local person, William Gleason, who was living in Dade County. And the New York Times of December the 3rd, 1876 will give you a lot of information if you pick it up on the microfilm or web and what all. But it was decided with the three states of the election for South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. But Florida made there was 14 votes down in Dade County that made the difference, and that's why Hayes got elected by one electoral vote.
That's interesting. Thanks for sharing the story with us, John. Dave, any thoughts there?
Yeah, the three states, there were actually four states that were contested, but Oregon was just one, and it was an internal matter. But yeah, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. But remember those 14 votes, we don't really know how those votes were changed. We don't know if Republicans changed them afterward. We don't know if Democrats were. The big argument that Republicans were making was that you were forcing people to vote for Democrats. You were putting a gun in their face and forcing them. And so what do we talk about now? We talk about election fraud. Well, that's election fraud.
Mm-hmm.
So does it invalidate the election? Does it? And the process by which they had to solve this is just a Faustian bargain of epic proportions. I mean, really, virtually every race problem you have in this country today can be traced to those three electoral college states and the compromise that was made to put Rutherford B. Hayes in the White House.
Interesting. Up next, we've got Skip in Satellite Beach. Hey, Skip, welcome.
Yeah, good morning, Third Wisest Man. And Dave, thank you so much for these really enlightening tidbits of history that, I'm a bit of a history buff, but I'm learning a lot of stuff this morning. Thank you so much. I just wondered what your thoughts were on the 17th Amendment. I've always thought of it as the one that destroyed federalism and probably the most damaging single amendment to the original Constitution and the delicate balance that Madison and his pals set up. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Thank you, Skip. Appreciate it. Dave?
The 17th Amendment is problematic, but the 16th Amendment, in my view, was far more destructive. The problem with the 17th Amendment is that you were dealing with an era when people wanted they saw the Senate particularly as a millionaires club, because they were appointed by the federal government, the state governments. There was a lot of bribery going on. People were getting into the Senate who shouldn't have been into the Senate, and the people wanted change. And it's the one time in our history where the Congress of the United States was legitimately afraid of an Article 5 convention. They were convinced that an Article 5 convention was going to happen and that the people were going to change the Constitution to elect senators directly. And so they figured they'd beat them to the punch and do it themselves and get reelected for supporting what the people wanted. So even in that, it's just political manipulation.
And what makes you think the 16 was worse? What specifically there?
Income taxes, direct taxes. I firmly believe that the only reason our government wastes so much money is because we keep giving it to them. And the only reason we keep giving it to them is because they have a constitutional amendment that says they can require it.
Yeah, I don't know that necessarily changed the balance of how things are done, though. I mean, yeah, it gave them access to your wallet, right?
Oh, Bill. Perhaps someday we'll talk about that.
Perhaps we will. Let's check in next with Steve in Melbourne. Hey, Steve, welcome to the show.
Well, it kind of changed, Bill, from what I called in on, but it's still on the topic, I always thought that most of the voter fraud only and Democrats have been doing it all the way back since Kennedy-Nixon. But obviously with your honored guest there, it looks like it's been since this country was founded, and we still don't fix it.
I think there's a reason for that. I think it's human nature that humans playing in something are going to find a way to corrupt it. Dave, give me your thoughts there.
When you look at the process it took for Congress to untangle this Gordian knot of the 1876 election, you start realizing that, voter fraud has been, for God's sakes, in the early days of the country, the way we would have elections is each candidate would buy a cask of rum and they would sit out front of the electioneering thing and literally get people drunk enough to vote for them. That seems fraudulent to me, too. At any rate, fraud has been going on. I'm not naive enough to believe that it's only Democrats, nor would I ever even say that. But in 1876, and I would say 1876 through the end of the Jim Crow era in the 1950s, 60s, it was very commonplace to use voter intimidation and voter fraud to force people, specifically African-American citizens, to give up their franchise. And it was done intentionally. That's the part that really bothers me, and it should bother us. And, Bill, if I could pull one lesson from this, it's simply this. The Republican Party and the Democrat Party never switched places. That's a myth. The reality, though, is that the Republican Party gave up on its greatest legacy. They sold it out. Their greatest legacy was they freed slavery. And in 1876, to put Rutherford B. Hayes in the White House, they gave up on that legacy. And believe me, the Democrats have never let you forget it since then. They never will let you forget it. They will make you think that they're the saviors, that they're the ones who did all this, the great stuff. And because of that, that's why you believe that January 6th was unprecedented. That's why we were told we have to believe that. That's why we're told that elections are too important to be left to the states.
Very good. Dave Bowman, it's been an interesting hour, and I always appreciate that. Anything in particular that you're digging into history-wise, not necessarily for here, but as you continue doing this all the time? What are you looking at now? We got about a minute here.
I am so enthralled by what's happening in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Russia, Europe, and Barbara Tuchman's fantastic book, The Guns of August. We are so locked in July 1914 thinking, the July crisis of 1914 thinking, that, frankly, I'll be surprised if we get out of this year without another world war.
Wow. We'll talk that when we can, too, and you can always catch up with Dave at Plausibly Live, the Dave Bowman Show podcast, thedavebowmanshow.com. Dave, thank you so much. It was a great hour, and I appreciate it.
See you next week.
All right, it sounds good. O'Galley Electric made this hour of the program possible. Tomorrow, a wide open Wednesday. Anything you want to talk, anytime you call the show. If you want to talk history, you should have called today, though, because that's Dave's forte, not mine. But, hey, I'll see you in the morning at 6. Don't be late.